The San Fernando Valley in 1986 was a place of endless sun and sprawling possibility. It was the California of postcards, a landscape of wide boulevards, ranch-style homes, and the quiet hum of ambition. For 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen and her new husband, John Rutten, it was the perfect place to begin their life together. They had just moved into a stylish condominium in the heart of Van Nuys. Sherry was a rising star, the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, respected for her intelligence and warm, compassionate nature. John was a brilliant engineer, carving out his own successful career. They were a golden couple, deeply in love, their future stretching out before them like the bright, clear California sky. Their home was filled with wedding gifts and the easy laughter of newlyweds. Life was not just good, it was perfect. If you want to hear more true crime stories, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. But a shadow from the past loomed over their new life, a shadow John believed had faded, but which Sherry could not seem to escape. The shadow had a name: Stephanie Lazarus. Lazarus was a fellow student John had dated in college. Their relationship had been intense, but John had broken it off, recognizing that their futures lay on different paths. He had fallen in love with Sherry. Lazarus, however, had not let go. She was an imposing figure, a physical powerhouse who had become a patrol officer with the Los Angeles Police Department. Her obsession with John was relentless. She would show up at his mother's house in tears. She would appear unannounced at the condo he now shared with Sherry. On one occasion, Sherry came home to find Lazarus inside, in her LAPD uniform, there under the guise of talking to John. The confrontations were unsettling. Sherry, a woman known for her confidence, confessed to a friend that she was afraid of this woman, this police officer who refused to accept that the man she loved had moved on. The morning of February 24th, 1986, began like any other. The California sun was already warming the pavement as John Rutten prepared to leave for work. Sherry, who had called in sick with a back injury sustained at an aerobics class, was resting at home. They said their goodbyes, the casual, loving farewell of a couple secure in their world. The day was quiet. Neighbors heard nothing out of the ordinary, just the distant sounds of a city waking up. But inside the sanctuary of their home, a brutal, desperate struggle was unfolding. A fight for life, waged against an intruder, fueled by years of jealousy and rage. At the end of that struggle, 3 gunshots echoed, unheard by the outside world, and the bright future of Sherry Rasmussen was extinguished. Later that evening, John Rutten returned home. The first thing he noticed was the garage door, standing wide open, a flicker of unease. Then he saw it, the broken glass of the sliding door. His heart began to pound in his chest. He stepped inside, calling Sherry's name. The silence that answered him was heavy, absolute. The living room was in disarray. And then he found her. His vibrant, beautiful wife was dead on the floor, the victim of a savage attack. In that moment, John Rutten's world, the perfect life they had built together, was irrevocably shattered. The initial LAPD investigation in 1986 was swift, confident, and catastrophically wrong. When detectives from the Van Nuys division arrived at the crime scene, they saw signs of a struggle in a ransacked bedroom. Sherry's purse was missing, and her new BMW, a wedding gift from her parents, was gone. To them, the case looked open and shut, a daytime burglary gone horribly wrong. They theorized that 2 male burglars, surprised by Sherry's presence at home, had panicked and killed her. But the clues that contradicted this theory were everywhere. High-end electronic equipment, including a new VCR, sat untouched. More importantly, the violence inflicted upon Sherry was deeply personal. She had been brutally beaten and shot 3 times, and there was a bizarre, vicious bite mark on her arm, a sign of a struggle far more intimate than a typical burglary. Sherry's heartbroken father, Nels Rasmussen, pleaded with the lead detective, Lyle Meyer. He told him about his daughter's fear, about the obsessive ex-girlfriend who was an LAPD officer. He gave them her name, Stephanie Lazarus. But the detectives dismissed him. They were convinced they knew what had happened. The name of one of their own officers was never written down, never investigated. The bite mark was swabbed, but with no DNA technology available, it was simply filed away. The case, mislabeled and misunderstood, quickly went cold. To understand why a grieving father's desperate pleas were so easily ignored, one must understand the culture of the Los Angeles Police Department in the 1980s. Under the leadership of the formidable and controversial Chief Daryl Gates, the LAPD was molded into an aggressive, quasi-military force. It was the era of the battering ram, of confrontational policing, and of an unshakable us versus them mentality. Within the department, a powerful code of conduct reigned supreme, the blue wall of silence. Loyalty was paramount. Cops protected their own, often at all costs. The idea that a police officer, a sworn protector of the city, could be a suspect in a brutal murder was, to the detectives of that era, simply unthinkable. It was a possibility that their worldview, their entire professional culture, was not equipped to compute. Stephanie Lazarus was not a potential suspect. She was a colleague, part of the Brotherhood. Nels Rasmussen was an outsider, a civilian, a grieving father whose emotions were, in their view, clouding his judgment. The detectives saw a crime scene that fit a familiar pattern of burglary, and they locked onto it with unwavering certainty. This tunnel vision, reinforced by a powerful institutional bias, created the blind spot that allowed a killer in their midst to simply walk away, leaving a family's quest for truth to languish in a forgotten file for more than 2 decades. In a small, sterile interview room at the Van Nuys station, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and bureaucracy, Nels Rasmussen sat opposite Detective Lyle Meyer. The grief was a physical weight on Nels, his face a mask of exhaustion and sorrow. But beneath the grief was a current of fierce, paternal resolve. He had brought a notepad, his thoughts methodically organized. Meyer, for his part, leaned back in his chair, an air of professional detachment about him, a man on autopilot, dealing with another emotional next of kin. Nels began, his voice steady despite the tremor of rage he felt. He spoke of his daughter, of her kindness, her professionalism, and her recent marriage. Then he got to the point. He detailed Stephanie Lazarus's behavior, not as a grieving father's vague suspicions, but as a series of specific, alarming events. He described Lazarus showing up at Sherry's workplace in uniform to confront her. He recounted the tearful, desperate phone calls John had received. He explained that this wasn't just a jilted ex-girlfriend. This was an obsessive, unstable individual with a badge and a gun. Meyer listened, his expression unchanged, occasionally jotting a note. When Nels finished, the detective sighed, a weary, condescending sound. He explained that all evidence pointed to a burglary, that domestic angles were always considered, but in this case, the signs were clear. He talked about transient criminals, about the randomness of urban life. He treated Nels's carefully presented information as the rambling of a man overwrought with grief. Nels pushed back, his voice rising. He insisted they were ignoring the most obvious lead, but he could see it in the detective's eyes. The decision had already been made. He was being managed, placated. He walked out of that police station, not only with the crushing weight of his daughter's death, but with a new, terrifying burden. The knowledge that the people meant to find her killer had already decided to stop looking. For the next 23 years, the murder of Sherry Rasmussen remained a ghost in the LAPD's files. The case file, thick with the flawed burglary theory, gathered dust on a shelf. During those same years, Stephanie Lazarus thrived. She moved from patrol officer to detective, building a reputation as a specialist in art theft cases. She was respected, well-liked, a dedicated officer who married another detective and started a family. She worked out of the same police headquarters where the evidence from Sherry's murder was stored. For more than 2 decades, the killer and the clues to her crime existed under the same roof, a dark and unbelievable secret hidden in plain sight. John Rutan, his life shattered by the loss of his wife, eventually moved on, but the trauma of her murder never left him. Sherry's parents, Nels and Loretta, never gave up hope for justice. But as the years turned into decades, that hope began to fade, eroded by the dismissive certainty of the original investigators. The truth, it seemed, was buried forever. In 2009, a new generation of detectives in the LAPD's cold case unit pulled the dusty file for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. It was a routine review, one of thousands of unsolved cases. But as Detective Jim Nuttall and his team read through the old reports, they were stunned. The original detective's laser focus on the burglary theory made no sense. Why would burglars ignore valuable electronics? Why was the violence so personal? And then they read the notes from Sherry's father, his desperate, ignored pleas to investigate John Rutan's ex-girlfriend, the LAPD cop. It was a stunning revelation. For the first time in 23 years, someone was looking at the case not as a burglary, but as a murder fueled by jealousy. The detectives knew they were treading on dangerous ground. Their prime suspect was not some unknown criminal. She was one of them, a respected member of the department. They had to proceed with absolute secrecy. The key, they realized, lay in that long-forgotten piece of evidence, the swab from the bite mark on Sherry's arm. It had been preserved in a freezer tube for over 2 decades. In 1986, it was just a piece of cotton. In 2009, it was a potential time capsule containing the killer's DNA. The journey of that small piece of evidence from a dusty box to a definitive piece of proof was a marvel of forensic science. The detective's hand carried the evidence tube to the serology DNA unit of the LAPD crime lab. The lab itself was a world away from the gritty squad rooms, a sterile environment of humming machines and focused technicians in white coats. The first challenge was the age and condition of the sample. Over 23 years, DNA degrades, breaking down into smaller, less useful fragments. The technician, Jennifer Butterworth, knew that a standard DNA analysis would likely fail. She would have to use a more sensitive and advanced technique known as polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. This process acts like a biological copy machine, taking the few surviving fragments of DNA and replicating them millions of times over, until there is enough genetic material to create a full profile. It's a painstaking process, requiring a sterile environment to prevent contamination from even a single stray cell. Days were spent carefully extracting the genetic material from the cotton swab, amplifying it, and then feeding it into a sequencer, a machine that reads the unique genetic markers that identify an individual. The detectives submitted the swab to the crime lab, the request disguised within a batch of other cold cases to avoid raising suspicion. Then they waited. The results came back, and they were explosive. The DNA from the bite mark belonged to a woman. In that moment, the official narrative that had stood for 23 years was completely demolished. The killers were not 2 male burglars. The killer was a woman. At the same time, a forensic odontologist examined the photographs of the bite mark itself. The expert concluded that the pattern of the teeth, the deep impressions, and the bruising indicated a bite, made not in self-defense, but in a moment of extreme, uncontrollable rage. It was a bite of fury. The science was painting a psychological portrait that perfectly matched the motive of a jealous lover. The cold case team now had a scientific foundation for their suspicions. Their focus now narrowed with chilling certainty onto Detective Stephanie Lazarus, but they still needed to prove it. The cold case team began a covert surveillance operation, a delicate and dangerous dance to investigate one of their own colleagues without alerting her. Inside a cramped surveillance van, parked down the street from Lazarus's suburban home, Detectives Jim Nuttall and Dan Jaramillo sat in the pre-dawn darkness. The van smelled of cold coffee and stale tension. For days, this had been their world. Jaramillo lowered a pair of binoculars. "She's on the move," he said, his voice a low murmur. They watched as Stephanie Lazarus, now a mother in her late 40s, loaded her child into the car and drove off, just another working mom starting her day. But to the men in the van, she was the target. The psychological strain of the operation was immense. Every phone call, every email carried a risk. They couldn't use department resources in the usual way for fear of tipping her off. They were hunting one of their own, and the paranoia was constant. Was she watching them back? Did she have friends who might alert her? It was a cat-and-mouse game played entirely within the confines of the LAPD. This wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about confronting an institutional nightmare. The men in that van knew that if they were right, the fallout would shake the department to its core. They had to be perfect. They had to be patient. They waited for their moment, for a single discarded object that could connect a respected detective to a brutal 23-year-old crime. They followed Lazarus, documenting her movements, learning her habits. They needed to get a sample of her DNA to compare with the profile from the bite mark, and they had to do it without her knowledge. The opportunity came on a seemingly ordinary day. Detectives watched as Lazarus, while on a shopping trip, discarded a cup she had been drinking from into a public trash can. As soon as she was out of sight, an officer moved in and retrieved it. The cup was carefully sealed and rushed to the crime lab. The test was run. It was a perfect match. The DNA on the cup was identical to the DNA from the saliva left in the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm 23 years earlier. They had her. The ghost from the past now had a face, a badge, and a name. The detectives had their killer. Now, they just had to figure out how to arrest a decorated detective inside the very headquarters of the Los Angeles Police Department. On June 5, 2009, detectives devised a plan. They called Stephanie Lazarus, telling her they needed her expertise on a suspect in an art theft case. They asked her to meet them in a specialized interview room in the Parker Center, LAPD's main headquarters. The room was wired for audio and video. Lazarus arrived, confident and relaxed, a notepad in her hand, ready to help her colleagues. The detective started casually, asking about her patrol days, her old partners, and then they mentioned the name John Rutan. A flicker of something crossed Lazarus's face, but she maintained her composure. She admitted to knowing him, to dating him. Then the detectives mentioned his wife, Sherry Rasmussen. Lazarus's demeanor began to shift. She fidgeted. Her answers became evasive. The friendly chat had become an interrogation. For nearly an hour, the detectives calmly and methodically presented the facts, walking her through the day of the murder, asking her about her own journals that detailed her heartbreak over John, asking her about reports that her service weapon had been stolen just after the murder. Lazarus deflected, denied, and grew visibly agitated, her confidence crumbling with each new piece of information. Finally, the detectives revealed the ultimate truth: the bite mark, the DNA. At that moment, the mask completely fell away. Stephanie Lazarus, the decorated detective, was speechless. As the interrogation concluded, her own colleagues placed her under arrest for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. The trial of Stephanie Lazarus in 2012 was a sensation. It was a story of love, obsession, and an almost unbelievable betrayal of trust. A decorated LAPD detective was on trial for a murder she had committed while a young officer, a crime her own department had failed to solve for over 2 decades. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Shannon Presby, knew they had the science on their side, but they also needed to tell a human story. Their closing argument was the culmination of that effort, a narrative designed to transport the jury back to 1986. Presby stood before the jury, not with anger, but with a quiet, solemn intensity. He spoke of Sherry Rasmussen, not as a victim in a crime file, but as a woman full of life and love on the cusp of a beautiful future. He then painted a vivid picture of the evidence, piece by piece. He described Nels Rasmussen, a father whose instincts were right all along, but whose voice was silenced by a wall of institutional arrogance. He held up the photograph of the bite mark, calling it a signature of rage, a story told not in ink, but in flesh. He walked the jury through the science, explaining how a single microscopic cell, preserved by chance and uncovered by diligence, had survived for 23 years to speak the truth. He pointed at Stephanie Lazarus and described a woman consumed by an obsession so powerful that she was willing to shatter a family, betray her badge, and live a lie for more than 2 decades, all to destroy the happiness of a woman who had what she wanted. He concluded by asking the jury to do for Sherry Rasmussen what the original investigators had failed to do: to listen to the evidence, to see the truth, and to finally, after a quarter of a century of silence, hold her killer accountable. The defense argued that the DNA evidence was contaminated, that the bite mark swab had been improperly handled over the years. They portrayed the crime scene as a chaotic mess, suggesting the DNA could have been transferred accidentally. They tried to create doubt, to argue that the 23-year-old evidence was simply too old to be trusted. But the evidence was too strong, the science was too precise, and the story of obsession was too compelling. After weeks of testimony, the jury found Stephanie Lazarus guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. For Sherry Rasmussen's parents, Nels and Loretta, it was a moment of profound, bittersweet justice. They had known the truth for 23 years, but no one would listen. Now, a jury had finally confirmed what they had suspected all along. Years later, long after the trial had ended and the headlines had faded, retired Detective Jim Nuttall sat in his quiet study. On his wall was a framed photo of his cold case team, the men who had dared to look inside their own house and expose a monster. He often thought about the Lazarus case. It wasn't just another solved murder. It was a profound lesson in the fallibility of institutions and the persistence of truth. He recalled the paranoia, the feeling of being a traitor while doing the most righteous police work of his life. He remembered the look on Lazarus's face in the interrogation room, that moment when the confident detective dissolved and the cornered killer emerged. The case had changed him. It had solidified his belief that evidence, science, and a willingness to question everything are the only true constants in the pursuit of justice. It was a dark and troubling chapter in the history of the LAPD, but it was also a story of redemption, a testament to the fact that no wall, not even a blue one, is strong enough to hold back the truth forever. The case of Stephanie Lazarus stands as a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones hiding in plain sight, shrouded in the very uniforms meant to signify trust and protection.